This is the story of Nathan Carter and his wife Olivia Carter. One evening last spring, a woman who had believed her marriage was built on solid ground found herself holding a photograph she was never supposed to see. According to Olivia, the moment didn't arrive with sirens or shouting. It came quietly, the way most devastating things do, tucked inside an envelope that had been left, perhaps carelessly, perhaps not, on Nathan's home office desk. She described the feeling as something shifting beneath her feet, like a floor that had always been there suddenly deciding it no longer needed to hold her weight. "I didn't even understand what I was looking at," she told us. "And then I understood everything." This is what she shared, a story about secrets, about a son who saw more clearly than either of his parents, and about what it means to choose your family twice. This is how it happened, or at least this is how I remember it. As best as memory allows when it's been blurred by everything that came after, the morning it started was a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesday was the day Nathan made coffee. It was one of those small, specific things that had become part of the architecture of our life together. The kind of detail that seems meaningless until it isn't. Every other morning of the week, the coffee maker ran on its timer, and I'd come downstairs to find the pot already half empty, Nathan's travel mug gone from its hook, the front door sealed shut behind him like punctuation. But Tuesdays he had a standing call with his board that didn't begin until 9, which meant for exactly 1 hour and 45 minutes each week, my husband was home in the same way people are home, present, unhurried, taking up space in the kitchen with both hands wrapped around a mug instead of a phone. I used to love Tuesdays. That particular morning, Liam had already eaten. He'd had cereal standing up, which I'd told him approximately 400 times not to do, and he was upstairs searching for a shoe, the singular shoe, the missing shoe that somehow found its way behind the bathroom door every single week without fail. Nathan was standing at the counter with his back to me, watching the backyard through the window the way he sometimes did, like he was waiting for something to happen out there in the damp April grass. "Liam's going to miss the bus," I said. "He's got 6 minutes. He doesn't have his left shoe." Nathan turned around then, and I noticed, not for the first time but maybe more consciously than usual, how tired he looked. Not the tired of a late night or a difficult morning, the tired that accumulates, the kind that lives just beneath the surface of a person's expression and doesn't disappear after sleep. He'd been looking that way for several weeks, and I had been cataloging it the way I cataloged most things about him lately, observing without asking, noting without naming. "Big presentation Thursday," he said, as if that explained it. Maybe it did. Nathan was the kind of person whose professional weight was visible on him physically, in the set of his shoulders, in the way he held his jaw, in how many times he checked his phone during a meal. He ran a mid-sized logistics company he'd built over 11 years, and the company was in the middle of expanding into 2 new markets simultaneously, which meant he had been operating at some elevated frequency for months. I understood this. I had married the work as much as I had married the man, and for a long time, I'd made my peace with it. We had been together for 9 years, married for 7. Liam was 6.5, possessed of his father's dark eyes and my tendency to overthink everything, and he was the kind of child who noticed the emotional temperature of a room before he noticed anything else in it. He'd once asked me, when he was 4, why Daddy's voice sounded like a door closing. I hadn't known what to say to that. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood across the kitchen island from Nathan. And for a moment we were just 2 people sharing a room, not unfamiliar with each other, not unkind, but not particularly close either, in the way that couples can share extraordinary proximity and somehow remain across a certain distance from one another. It wasn't that we fought, we didn't fight. If anything, the absence of friction was its own kind of problem, like we had both agreed, without ever discussing it, to smooth every surface until there was nothing left to grip. "You should take a real weekend sometime soon," I said. "Not a working one." He made a non-committal sound and looked back out the window. "Nathan, I heard you, Olivia." Liam came thundering down the stairs then, one shoe on, one in hand, backpack hanging half off his shoulder, and the moment, whatever it was becoming, dissolved. He ate nothing else, accepted a kiss from me, shrugged one off from Nathan, and was out the door at a run. We watched him through the window, the 2 of us, and Nathan's expression softened in the way it only did when Liam was involved. It was one of the truest things about him. His love for his son was uncomplicated in a way that very little else in Nathan's life ever seemed to be. "He's going to make it," Nathan said. "He always does." The bus pulled away. Nathan refilled his coffee. I started clearing the cereal bowl Liam had abandoned on the counter. This was the shape of our mornings. I should say something about what our marriage was in those days before everything changed. Not to be fair to myself, or to Nathan, or to any particular version of the story, just to be accurate. Because I think people sometimes expect a marriage that's in trouble to look a certain way, and ours didn't look that way at all. There was no visible damage. There was no visible much of anything. We met when I was 28 and Nathan was 31, introduced through a mutual friend at a dinner party I'd almost canceled on because I had a deadline the next morning. I was working as a brand strategist at a mid-sized agency. He had just taken his company public in a small but meaningful way and was wearing the particular kind of quiet confidence that comes from surviving something hard. He wasn't loud about himself. That was what I first noticed, that he didn't perform. Most men I dated performed constantly. Nathan just sat across from me and asked questions and actually listened to the answers. And by the end of the night, I had told him 3 things I hadn't planned to tell anyone. We dated for 2 years. He proposed on an ordinary Tuesday. There it was that day again in our kitchen, no grand gesture. Just a small box and something in his eyes that made it feel more significant than any elaborate display could have. I said yes before he finished the sentence. What I'm trying to say is, I chose him carefully. I am not someone who rushes, and for a long time the marriage was what I had chosen it to be. But something had been shifting over the past year and a half, and I want to be honest about that rather than retell the story as if everything was fine until it suddenly wasn't. Things had been quieter between us. Not peaceful quiet, but withheld quiet. Nathan was more absent than present, even when he was physically there. He'd begun closing his office door at home in the evenings, which he hadn't used to do. He texted during dinner. He slept on his side of the bed like it was its own separate country. I told myself it was the expansion. I told myself it was stress. I told myself a lot of things, and I believe I half believed all of them. What I didn't tell myself, what I refused to form into an actual thought, was that something might be wrong in a way that couldn't be attributed to work. The secondary character in this story entered it the way disruptive things often do, through a perfectly ordinary action. Her name was Claire. She was Nathan's executive assistant, 34, efficient and sharp and liked by everyone who worked with her, including me. She had a dry wit and a memory for details that bordered on unsettling, and a way of managing Nathan's chaos that I genuinely admired. I had always liked Claire. I had also, at some point in the past year, begun to notice something in her manner around me, a slight carefulness, a quality of attention that went 1 degree beyond professional warmth, as though she knew something and was navigating the weight of knowing it. I had noticed this and filed it away without examining it. It came back to me that Tuesday afternoon. I went into Nathan's home office to leave some mail on his desk. He worked from home on Tuesday afternoons before his evening call, and he wasn't in there yet. The room smelled like him, the faint trace of his cedar and citrus soap, old coffee, the specific paper smell of printed reports. His desk was organized the way his mind worked, which was to say it appeared chaotic but followed an internal logic he alone understood. I set the mail down, and I saw the envelope. It was sitting at an angle against the base of his monitor, slightly open, the way something gets when someone's read it and put it back without fully closing it. It was addressed to Nathan, handwritten, no return address. That alone wouldn't have been unusual. He received personal correspondence at the office sometimes. What was unusual was the photograph. It was edging out of the envelope, just barely, maybe an inch of image visible. The corner of a face, small, a child's face. I don't know why I pulled it out. I'm still not entirely sure. Perhaps because it was already almost showing itself. Perhaps because something in my chest had already understood before my mind caught up. It was a photograph of a little boy. He looked, I want to be precise about this, he looked to be perhaps 4 years old in the picture, maybe slightly younger. Dark hair, Nathan's eyes. Not resembling Nathan in a vague, possible way, but in the specific, undeniable way that certain physical traits announce their lineage like a signature. Behind the photograph was a single sheet of paper. I read it once, then again, then a third time as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less than what they were. The letter was from a woman named Sophie Bennett. It was short, only a few paragraphs. It said that she had not known how to find him until recently. It said she understood if this was difficult. It said that the boy's name was Eli. It said Eli was 4 years old and healthy and a wonderful child, and that she wasn't asking for anything dramatic, only for Nathan to know he existed, and to perhaps one day want to know him. It said she thought he deserved to know. I put the photograph back, I put the letter back, I placed the envelope almost exactly where I'd found it, tilted against the base of the monitor. Then I walked out of the room, down the hallway, and into the kitchen, and I stood at the sink with the water running and both hands gripping the edge of the counter, and I stood there for a long time. Nathan came home at 7:15 that evening. I had made dinner. I do not remember what I made. Something with pasta, I think. Something I could do on autopilot. Something that required just enough attention to keep my hands occupied while my mind ran its relentless loops. Liam talked through dinner about a book report, about a boy in his class who'd said something funny at recess, about whether we thought dogs could tell time. Nathan answered him in full sentences, which he didn't always manage on weekday evenings. He ate without looking at his phone. He poured himself a glass of water and then poured me one too, which was the kind of small unconscious courtesy that had always felt to me like one of the quiet languages of love. I watched him do it and felt something terrible move through me. Because I had spent the last 4 hours, while I'd made dinner, while I'd supervised Liam's bath, while I'd responded to 3 work emails without any memory of what I'd written, I had spent those hours constructing and dismantling and reconstructing a version of what this could mean. The letter had said Eli was 4 years old. Nathan and I had been together for 9 years, married for 7. 4 years ago, we had been married for 3 years. We had been trying in the distracted, hope-adjacent way of 2 busy people to have a second child. We hadn't succeeded. I had quietly grieved it. Nathan had said the right things. Life had continued. 4 years ago. I kept returning to that number like a bruise you press because you need to feel where it hurts. I could not get through dinner. I got through dinner. I cleared the plates and helped Liam with his book report and kissed him goodnight and turned out his light and came back downstairs. And Nathan was in his office with the door closed. I stood in the hallway. I thought about knocking. I went to bed instead. I lay in the dark and listened to the house, and somewhere around midnight, I heard Nathan come upstairs and pause outside the bedroom door for a moment. Longer than usual, a few extra seconds, and then come in and undress and get into bed beside me without knowing I was awake. I stared at the ceiling. 4 years, I want to be honest about something. I did not confront Nathan the next day, or the day after that. This might seem strange. It might seem like weakness or avoidance or one of those things people do in stories that makes you want to lean into the page and just say something. But there's a particular kind of paralysis that comes when something is so large and so close that you can't find the edge of it. You can't figure out where to stand in relation to it. You're not waiting for courage exactly. You're waiting for the world to make enough sense again that you can find language for what you're holding. So I moved through those days in a particular kind of suspension. I worked, I drove Liam to school and picked him up. I had a call with a client on Wednesday morning and said smart, useful things about brand positioning that I later could not recall. I went to yoga on Thursday, which I did every Thursday, and lay in savasana at the end with my eyes closed and my hands open and everything inside me coiled so tight I could barely breathe. Nathan moved through those same days without apparent awareness that anything had shifted. He worked. He texted during dinner on Wednesday, which I noted. He was in bed before me Thursday, which I also noted. He asked me on Friday morning if I'd called the roof people about the estimate, because we'd been getting estimates since February, and I said no, and he said he'd do it, and he probably wouldn't. On Saturday morning, I drove Liam to his soccer practice, and while I sat on the sideline with the other parents, watching the children scramble beautifully and chaotically across the damp grass, I took out my phone and typed Sophie Bennett's name into a search engine. I told myself I just wanted to understand. Sophie Bennett wasn't difficult to find. She was a landscape architect in Portland, Oregon. She had a professional website with a small professional photograph. A woman in her mid-30s, light brown hair, practical clothes, an open expression that suggested a person who was not interested in performance. Nothing about her suggested chaos or scheming. She looked like someone who made difficult decisions quietly and tried to do the right thing. I stared at her photograph for a long time. Then I closed the browser and watched my son score a goal and jump to my feet and cheered with every other parent on that sideline. And Liam looked up and found my face immediately in the crowd. the way he always did, and grinned his wide, unself-conscious grin. I clapped until my hands stung. The layered conversations began the following week. They weren't conversations about the letter, or Sophie, or Eli. They were conversations about everything adjacent to those things, about the space between Nathan and me, about the closed doors, about the distance I couldn't name directly but circled constantly. Monday evening, while Liam was asleep, "You seem far away lately." Nathan looked up from his laptop. "Work is. I know what work is. I'm not talking about work." He closed the laptop. This surprised me. He looked at me across the coffee table and something moved through his expression. Not guilt, or not only guilt. More like a kind of heaviness, the look of someone who has been carrying something alone for a while and doesn't know how much longer they can do it. "Things are complicated right now," he said. "Between us, just in general, I wanted to push." I sat with the question of pushing for a moment, and then something in me decided against it. Not from fear, I think, but from the instinct that whatever he was holding, he needed to be the one to set it down. I couldn't take it from him. I didn't want to. "Okay," I said. He picked the laptop back up. I went upstairs. The fourth wall Wednesday of that week, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop, answering emails, and Nathan came through to refill his coffee and stopped beside me and looked at the screen over my shoulder, which he sometimes did just to see what I was working on. An old habit, the kind of small intimacy that had survived everything else. "What is that?" he asked. "Newsletter draft." "For the Whitmore account." He stood there for a second, and then, in a tone that was entirely unlike his usual register, flat, slightly removed, almost like a different frequency had briefly overtaken his voice, he said, "I don't know. Maybe like this story or subscribe or something." I looked up at him. He was already frowning slightly, like he wasn't sure where that had come from either. "What?" I said. He shook his head. "Nothing. Sorry. It's nothing." He took his coffee and went back to his office. I stared at my screen for a moment, then kept typing. Thursday evening, Liam did something that I have thought about many times since. He came into the kitchen while I was washing up after dinner. Nathan was on a call upstairs, door closed, and Liam climbed onto the stool at the counter and sat there in his pajamas watching me with the focused, quiet attention that he sometimes turned on a situation when he was trying to understand it. "Mom," he said after a while, "Is everything okay?" I turned to look at him. He was 6 years old, wearing dinosaur pajamas, and he was watching me with his father's eyes and an expression that was entirely his own, serious and open and patient. "Of course," I said. "Why?" He considered this for a moment. "You've been quiet," he said, "like when you're thinking about something big." I dried my hands on the dish towel and sat down across from him on the other stool. "What makes you say that?" "You make a face," he said simply. "When you're regular thinking, it's different. When you're big thinking, your eyes go sort of far away." I looked at my son. "Perceptive," I said. He didn't know what that word meant. He asked me what it meant, and I told him, and his face rearranged itself with the particular satisfaction of a child adding a word to his vocabulary, and then we talked about his dinosaur pajamas for a while, and which dinosaur was actually the most dangerous, and whether a velociraptor could beat a crocodile, and I held that conversation like a rope, gratefully, both hands. The realization settled in the way certain things do. Not as a sudden flash, but as an accumulation. By the end of that second week, I had moved from the shock of discovering into something that felt more like grief, which is in some ways worse because grief is larger and less defined, and you can live inside it for longer without finding the exit. What I kept returning to, and I want to be honest about this complexity, was not only the fact of Eli, it was the mathematics of it. 4 years ago, 3 years into our marriage, I had built a version of Nathan in my mind across 9 years. Not an idealized version. I knew him too well for that, knew his stubbornness and his silences and his tendency to manage everything internally until it became unmanageable. But I had built a version that I trusted, a version that had a particular shape. And now I was trying to understand whether that shape had always contained something I couldn't see, or whether I'd simply been wrong about the shape itself. Those are different things. They feel different. They require different responses. I wasn't sure yet which one I was dealing with. What I knew was that I had made an appointment, without telling Nathan, with a divorce attorney named Margaret Hale for the following Thursday. Not because I had decided, because I needed to understand what it would mean to decide. I thought this was rational. I still think it was rational. I also think it was the loneliest thing I did in those weeks, not the appointment itself, but the getting ready for it. Sitting with the information, alone, in rooms where my husband moved through his parallel life, and my son slept with his window cracked the way he liked it, and everything looked exactly like what it had always been. The last moment of part 2 belongs to a Friday evening, 2 weeks after I found the envelope. I was upstairs in the bedroom changing, and through the half-open door I could hear Nathan and Liam in the hallway below, Nathan having just gotten home. I could hear Liam's voice first, rapid and overlapping itself the way his voice got when he was excited. Something about school, a project, a model of the solar system he wanted to make out of fruit. And then Nathan's voice, lower, unhurried, actually asking questions, letting Liam talk. I stood very still with my shirt half over my head and listened. And there it was. Not guilt exactly, not softness exactly, but something in the middle. The way certain truths arrive not as revelations but as recognitions. The way you understand something you already knew. Nathan loved his son. Nathan loved this life that had not been a lie. The question was what else was also true. I finished changing and went downstairs, and we had dinner, the three of us, and it was, I want to say ordinary, but I mean that as the highest possible thing. It was ordinary. And I sat in the middle of it and tried to hold both things at once. How much I loved this and how close I was to burning it down, I told Nathan on a Sunday. Not about the appointment with the attorney, not yet. I told him I'd seen the letter. Liam was at a birthday party, one of those afternoon affairs with loud music and too much sugar and children, arriving home vibrating at a frequency beyond normal human range. We had 4 hours. I waited until Nathan was in the kitchen making lunch, and I came and stood in the doorway, and I said, I found the letter. In your office. About 3 weeks ago. He went very still. The kind of stillness that isn't an absence of movement, but a presence of something. All the motion going inward. The face becoming briefly unreadable. He set down the knife he'd been using. He turned to face me. He looked at me for a moment without saying anything, and I could see him calculating, not calculating the way guilty people calculate, not working out an excuse or a defense, but calculating the way someone does when they've been dreading a conversation for weeks, and are now finally standing at the edge of it, trying to find the right way in. Okay, he said, just that. Okay, I repeated. We stood in the kitchen and the word hung between us, and then I said, is it true? The letter? Yes. Yes, it's true. He exhaled a long, controlled breath. Olivia, I need you to say it clearly. He met my eyes. There is a child, a boy named Eli. He's 4 years old. His mother is Sophie Bennett. I didn't know he existed until 7 weeks ago. 7 weeks. That landed differently than I'd expected. I had assumed longer, had built the architecture of my grievance around a longer deception. 7 weeks was recent. 7 weeks was almost yesterday. You didn't know, I said. Before 7 weeks ago, no. Something in his voice was entirely unperformed, not defensive, not pleading, just direct in the way he became when he was most serious. I want to tell you everything. I've been trying to figure out how. I know that. I know there's no good way, and I know I should have told you the moment I found out, and I didn't, and that's on me completely. When did it happen? Before us. I need you to hear that first. Before us. Just barely, but before. We met in April 9 years ago. Sophie and I it was brief. A few months, 2 years before that. He paused. I didn't know she was pregnant. I didn't know. She said in the letter that she decided to handle it alone, that she didn't think I would be interested. And then she waited, and then she changed her mind about waiting. She said Eli started asking about his father. I was quiet for a long moment. Before us, 2 years before. The numbers rearranged themselves in my head, the architecture of my grievance shifting, not disappearing but changing shape. Why didn't you tell me when you got the letter? He looked away. First time he'd looked away. Because I didn't know what it meant yet. I didn't know what I was going to do. I needed to understand it before I could explain it to you, and then the understanding kept not coming, and the weeks kept passing, and every day that went by made it worse. He looked back at me. I know that's not good enough. It's not, I said. I know. We stood there. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car went past. Have you met him? I asked. No. I've spoken to Sophie once on the phone. 3 weeks ago. She's not asking for anything complicated. She's not here to take anything from us, Olivia. She just thought Eli should know his father exists. Sophie, her open, pragmatic face on her professional website. I thought he deserved to know. What do you want to do? I asked. He answered without hesitating. I want to be in his life. I want to be responsible. I want to do it in a way that involves you, that doesn't hurt Liam, that we figure out together. But I'm not going to pretend Eli doesn't exist. I can't do that. There was a moment, I need to record this accurately. There was a moment where something in me that had been compressed for 3 weeks released. Just slightly. Not forgiveness. Not resolution. Just the recognition that the man standing in my kitchen was, still, the man I had chosen. Complicated and flawed and not perfect and real. Then the other part of me, the part that had been sitting alone with this for 3 weeks, that had made the appointment with Margaret Hale, that had lain awake at midnight listening to him breathe, that part said, "That isn't enough. I need time," I said. I need space to figure out what I think about this. Okay, and Nathan, I waited until he looked at me directly. No more handling things alone. Whatever happens next, we talk about it. You don't go into your office and close the door on things that belong to both of us. He nodded. And then, almost so quietly, I nearly missed it. "I'm sorry. I should have told you I was scared." Nathan was not a man who used that word easily. "I know," I said. I turned and went upstairs, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I looked at the late afternoon light on the floor, and I thought about Eli and his photograph with his father's eyes. In the days that followed, the truth continued to surface in the quiet, methodical way it does once it's been let out. Not all at once, incrementally, the way ice melts, which is both slower and more complete than you expect. Nathan answered every question I asked. I asked carefully, and there were many questions, and he answered them without defensiveness, which was new. Or not new exactly, but more sustained than I was accustomed to. Something about finally being seen in the situation had rearranged him slightly. The closed-door quality that had been building for months had opened up, and I could see what had been happening behind it. A man who had received news he didn't know how to carry and had carried it badly, which is human even when it is also wrong. I told him about the attorney appointment. He didn't react the way I'd braced for. He just said, "Do you want to keep it?" "I don't know yet." "Okay. That doesn't scare you?" He looked at me steadily. "Of course it scares me. I'd rather have you terrified of losing something than pretend you're not." That was the most honest thing he'd said to me in over a year. I canceled the appointment with Margaret Hale. Not because I had decided, because I was willing to keep the question open a little longer. The decision that ended part 3 was not a dramatic one. It was made in the car on the way home from canceling the appointment, in the ordinary noise of traffic and a radio station playing something I didn't recognize. And it was simply, wait. Keep seeing clearly, keep asking. Don't decide from fear and don't decide from hope. Wait. Time passed, approximately 4 months. I want to say something true about what that stretch of time felt like, because I think people sometimes expect transformation to be visible and swift, and it generally isn't. What happened over those 4 months was more like a landscape changing between visits. You leave in summer and return in autumn, and the change is complete, but you can't point to any single moment when it happened. We talked, Nathan and I, more than we had in over a year. Not always productively, not always with grace. There were evenings that went sideways. Conversations that ended in the specific frustrated silence of two people who are trying hard and still not quite finding each other. But we talked. Doors stayed open. He stopped disappearing into work in the way that had felt for months like a kind of withdrawal. He made contact with Sophie. They spoke again, and he told me about the conversation in detail, the way we'd agreed. She was measured and direct, apparently, not hostile, not demanding. She had handled an enormous amount on her own and had not come to him with bitterness, which I found hard to reconcile and then gradually found easier. She loved her son. She wanted Eli to have more people in his corner. That was the whole of it. Nathan met Eli for the first time in June. He drove to Portland alone, which we had discussed. It seemed right that the first meeting be without the complexity of us, of Liam, of the full weight of what was being built. He came home that evening and sat at the kitchen table and was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "He has a gap between his 2 front teeth." He showed me his whole Lego collection. He wanted me to know every set. His voice was careful, contained. "He's a good kid, Olivia," I said. "I'm glad." And I was. That surprised me. The cleanliness of it, the fact that when I checked for resentment, I found mostly something that felt closer to sorrow, and then below that, something closer to hope. Liam knew something was happening. Of course he did. Liam always knew when something was happening. We had not yet told him, mostly because Nathan and I were still working out what telling him would mean, what shape to give it. He didn't ask directly, he circled. He would sit in the kitchen while we talked and get very busy with whatever he had in his hands, the focused not watching of a child who is absolutely watching. He asked, one evening, whether families could have different shapes. I said yes. He thought about that for a while and then went back to his Legos. I watched him and thought about how much of the shape of a child's understanding comes not from what they're told, but from what they absorb. Liam had absorbed something. He was holding it in the patient, waiting way of someone who trusts that the information will eventually arrive. Sophie reframed her own narrative over those months in ways I only understood later, secondhand, through the texture of what Nathan reported from their conversations. She had been living for 4 years with a story in which she was the only author. She had made every decision alone, had told it to herself a certain way, had protected herself and Eli by keeping the chapter closed. Opening it required her to revise the story she'd been telling, to make room for more characters, to accept the uncertainty that more characters bring. I found myself thinking about this more than I expected to. The particular courage of a person who opens a story they've been keeping closed, even when opening it is complicated, even when they don't know what the new version will say. She wasn't the villain in this story. I had tried in the early weeks to cast her that way, not consciously, but in the way our minds sometimes try to organize pain by assigning roles. It hadn't worked. She was a woman who had made decisions in circumstances she had not chosen, and had tried eventually to do better. I understood that. I didn't yet know if I could trust her. But I understood her. The internal shift in Nathan was slower and more private than I had access to, mostly. I knew it was happening the way you know weather is changing, not from any single indicator but from the accumulated evidence of 100 small ones. He was more present. He initiated conversations now. He asked questions about my work that went beyond the surface. He came to some soccer game in August and stood the whole time, didn't check his phone once. He also, in this matters, cried once. In the kitchen, which was apparently where our most significant moments happened. There was something about that room, the particular light, the way it opened onto the backyard, that seemed to undo pretense. He was standing at the counter and I came in and he had his back to me and something about the set of his shoulders told me before I could see his face. I didn't say anything. I went to stand beside him and I put my hand on his back and we stood there, and after a while he said, "I keep thinking about what he must have thought, Eli. All that time, thinking his father just wasn't there." "He's there now," I said. I know that. I just need to sit with the cost of it for a while." "Okay," I said, and I meant it. The self-deception that ran through those months, and I want to be honest about it, because I participated in it too, was the mutual, unspoken agreement to treat resolution as a destination we were approaching, when really we were still in the middle of the thing. We were doing well, we were doing the work. But there's a particular way that people who are trying hard can fall into performing recovery rather than experiencing it, can mistake the motions of healing for healing itself. I noticed this in myself around the 3rd month. I was telling the story to myself in my own head as though it were already resolved, as though the worst was behind us and we were simply waiting for time to confirm it. And that was partly true. But partly I was protecting myself from the possibility that it wasn't, which is its own kind of distance. The appointment with the attorney stayed canceled. I didn't reschedule it, but I kept the paperwork from it in a folder in my desk drawer, not as a threat, not even as a plan, just as a reminder that I was choosing this, not defaulting into it. That distinction mattered to me. It still does. By September, Eli had been to our home twice for short visits. The first time was the hardest. I stood in my own kitchen, that room again, and watched Nathan crouch down to Eli's level and say something that made the boy laugh, and I had the full complexity of that moment move through me. The tenderness and the grief and the strange, piercing love for Nathan that arrived alongside the pain rather than in spite of it. Not separate feelings, but layered ones. Eli was a quieter child than Liam. Careful where Liam was eager, watchful where Liam was expressive. He had Nathan's dark eyes and Nathan's way of becoming very still when he was paying close attention. He looked at me once, during the first visit, from across the room, with a quality of assessment that was so recognizably his father's that something in my chest turned over. "Hi," I said. "Hi," he said. A pause. "Do you like fruit?" he asked. "My mom says you always have fruit." I looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at the floor, somewhere between embarrassed and moved. "I do always have fruit," I said. "Do you want some?" "Yes, please," said Eli. I gave him an apple and we sat at the kitchen counter, and he told me about Portland and his preschool and his best friend whose name he said 3 times to make sure I'd gotten it right. He was 4 years old, and he was trying very carefully to introduce himself to the life that had always included him without knowing it. I didn't cry until later. Liam met Eli on the second visit, in late September. We had told Liam the week before, simply and carefully, in the way Nathan and I had rehearsed together. Liam had listened to the whole explanation with his characteristic stillness and then said, "So he's my brother." We had paused at that, the word brother arriving in the room like a stone dropped into water, the rings spreading outward. "Half-brother," Nathan said. "But brother," Liam said firmly, as though correcting an imprecision. We had looked at each other over his head. "Yes," I said. "Brother." Liam had nodded, satisfied, and gone back to whatever he'd been doing. The final moment of this story belongs to a Saturday in October. It was the kind of October day that feels like a gift, cool and clear, the light at that particular fall angle that makes everything look the way it does in memory, golden and slightly unreal. Nathan had taken Liam and Eli to the park, a thing they'd done twice now, the three of them building something careful and new that didn't have a name yet. I had stayed home. I stood at the kitchen window, the window Nathan had stood at months ago, watching the backyard, waiting for something to happen in the grass, and I drank my coffee and I thought about what I was going to do. Not about the future, exactly, not in strategic terms, more in the way of taking stock. The way you might stand in a room you've lived in for years and really look at it, notice its proportions, understand what it actually is. What I understood, standing there, the marriage I thought I had was not exactly the marriage I had. It was something more complicated, with more history in it than I'd known, with more people in it than I'd planned for. Nathan had failed me in a specific and real way, not through the existence of Eli, who was blameless in all of it, but through the 7 weeks of silence, through the months of half-presence before that, through the long habit of managing alone. Those failures were real. I was not pretending they weren't, but the man who had stood at the kitchen counter and cried about the cost of absence, that was real too. The man who drove to Portland alone and came home and told me carefully about a gap between 2 front teeth and a Lego collection, that was real. The man who had said, "Of course it scares me," when I'd told him about the attorney, real. I was not making excuses for him. I was adding up what was actually there. They came home around 2. I heard the car, and then voices, and then the front door opening, and then Liam's particular run up the front hall. That rhythm, his, absolutely his, the sound I have listened for every single day since the day he first learned to run. Eli was a few steps behind him, quieter, but animated in a way he was becoming more comfortable with. The protective shell of a careful child softening incrementally around people who had given him no reason to keep it up. Nathan came last, carrying both their jackets, a bit grass-stained, with the look of a man who had been genuinely, completely present for the past several hours and was still in it. He looked at me. I looked at him. Liam was already in the kitchen looking for a snack. Eli had followed him, a step behind, watching. "Good?" I asked Nathan. "Really good," he said. And then, quietly, "How are you?" Not the automatic version of that question, the real one. "I'm okay," I said. And then, because it was true, actually okay, he nodded. The moment I need to tell you about came 20 minutes later. I had been watching the boys at the kitchen counter, Liam explaining something to Eli with great authority, Eli listening with the full attention he brought to things, and I had been thinking, vaguely, about the folder in my desk drawer, the attorney's paperwork, the option I'd kept available like a hand on a door. I wasn't sure when I'd decided not to use it. I don't think there was a moment. I think the decision had accumulated the way the grief had. Incrementally, without fanfare, through the accumulation of all these ordinary moments, each one adding weight to one side of the scale until the scale had tipped and I hadn't even noticed the tipping. And then Liam looked up and found me, the way he always found me, and his expression shifted from whatever it had been to something more direct, more intentional, and he said, "Mom." "Yeah, babe?" He slid off his stool and crossed the kitchen to me, which he didn't always do. He was 6 and increasingly committed to a certain independence, a 6-year-old dignity that made spontaneous physical affection a gift rather than a given. He took my hand, both of mine actually, wrapping his smaller ones around them the way he'd done when he was very little and hadn't grown out of it as completely as he pretended. He didn't say anything. He just held my hands for a moment, looking up at me with his father's dark eyes and his own particular soul, and there was something in his expression, something that knew, in the way that children know things they shouldn't be able to know. From absorption and attention and love, something that said, "Stay." Not a plea, not desperation, just a quiet, certain knowing. I squeezed his hands. "I'm here," I said. He nodded, satisfied, the way he had nodded when he'd said, "But brother," the correction of an imprecision nod. And then he let go and went back to the counter and resumed explaining whatever it was he'd been explaining to Eli. I stood in the kitchen and felt the weight of everything settling. That evening, after the boys were in bed, both of them, Liam in his room and Eli in the guest room with the door left open the way he'd asked for, Nathan and I sat on the back porch in the October cold with a blanket over our knees, the way we had in the early years of the marriage, and we didn't talk very much. There was a lot that still needed talking about, a lot that was still unresolved, and would remain unresolved for a long time, because real things don't resolve cleanly, they evolve. Sophie and Nathan were still defining the shape of co-parenting. Liam was still processing in his patient interior way. Eli was still learning the width of the world that had opened up for him. I am still, in the middle of something that doesn't have an ending yet, and I want to be honest about that because I think pretending otherwise would be its own kind of deception. But that night, on the porch with the cold and the dark, and Nathan's shoulder against mine and the sound of the house settling around us, I thought about the word my son had used. Brother. No qualifier. No hedge. Just the word and the meaning and the firmness of it. I thought about what it takes to grow a family larger than you plan for it to be. The grief of it, the fear of it, the strange, unexpected grace of watching two small boys stand at a kitchen counter, one explaining and one listening, both of them, against all the complicated odds, beginning to belong to each other. I thought about the folder in my desk drawer. In the morning, I would take it out and shred it. Not because everything was healed. Not because trust was fully restored, or the road ahead was clear, or the story had arrived somewhere safe and certain, but because the decision I was making, the choosing of this family, this difficult, expanded, imperfect family, was mine, made with open eyes, made out of love rather than out of fear. That matters. I think that's the only thing that matters. I stayed. I've replayed that moment with Liam's hands in mine more times than I can count. I'm not sure what I expected when I started writing this, resolution maybe, or some cleaner kind of certainty. What I got instead was just the story as it actually happened, which is to say, messy and ongoing and still, somehow, worth it. He grabbed my hand and I stayed. That's the whole of it. And maybe that's enough.